Today we're going to take a look at the DEF pump. The DEF pump first showed up on the 2250 series engines, and it's located in the back by the aftertreatment tank. Many times it's up inside the frame. It's not over where the aftertreatment itself is, where there's a lot of heat. They keep it over towards the tank where there's cool. Sometimes you'd find the aftertreatment controller, if there was one, and the DEF pump both mounted up behind the DEF tank. That also helps them to keep the heated DEF lines a little shorter. With the DEF pump, the big problem they had in the climates where you could get into very cold temperatures and DEF fluid would freeze, and it freezes at about 22.5 degrees. And so if you get down around zero, that DEF is going to be a block of ice. So the problem that they had was if the DEF pump wasn't emptied of DEF before the system went totally asleep, in very cold weather, the pump would crack internally, or you'd start seeing DEF leaking around the pump at the seams, or it would actually leak into the harness. And I remember one job I saw an aftertreatment controller damaged because the DEF fluid had leached all the way through the plug, out of the DEF pump, through the plug that plugs into it, because it's a sealed plug, out into the harness, through the wires, and up into the aftertreatment controller. And if you wonder how that happens, that controller breathes. When it gets hot, it pushes air out. When it gets cold, it breathes in, but it breathes in through the harness. The modules typically breathe through their harness, so it pulls air between the wire and the wire sheath. They do that to keep salt and other elements out of that ECM and off those boards in there, off the circuitry. So that was the worst extreme I saw, where everything was green in the aftertreatment controller, green and white. The pins were half gone. The plug was almost impossible to get off the controller, and it had DEF in it, and it came from the pump. So that's the pump's big enemy, is DEF being left in it. So they've done some improvements to stop that at the pump itself. Some software, which we talked about in the video before this, to make sure that the lines are emptied. Again, they have a valve on the cooling system. It's an OEM part, but Cummins controls it to keep that DEF fluid thawed but not too hot. If it gets too hot, it can shut down or damage the DEF float that measures the temperatures, and you'll get faults for that. I have seen DEF fluid recorded at 165 degrees because of failure of that water valve. So always take a look at your fault snapshots. If you're having trouble with your tank float, especially the tank float failures for quality or level, make sure in that fault snapshot that there's not extreme DEF tank temperatures. Usually on a normal running system, I've never really seen it much over about 118 degrees, maybe 120. I don't live down in the south where the temperatures are extreme, but if a truck runs all day, that's about as hot as it's going to get. So especially if it's in cooler weather, or if the valve's leaking, the heater valve I'm talking about. So let's get to the pump and take a look at it. Here's our typical DEF pump on anything that's from 2010 to about 2019. Around 2019, the UL2 system came out, and generally speaking, the UL2 is what's on everything now. We'll talk about that in another video. This pump has two part numbers, one for the 12 volt, one for the 24. You can see them listed there. On the bottom left, where the electrical lead plugs onto the pump, where the pins come out of the pump body and the plug housing, if that's black, it's a 12 volt pump. If that face in there is gray, it's a 24 volt pump. The part number is also embossed into the plastic housing on the pump. These pumps are made by Bosch. They could be labeled by whoever's selling them, I guess, but Bosch is the manufacturer. Inside that pump, there is a heater to heat the DEF fluid that's sitting in the pump, because remember, we don't use DEF at a high rate. It doesn't travel through all the lines at any kind of high rate of speed. It's very slow moving. So while the engine's running and there's DEF in that pump, there is a heating element in the pump to keep the DEF in that pump from freezing. It can get cold, but it's not going to freeze. That pump also monitors the temperature internally and reports that back to the ECM, and you can log faults on that temperature circuit as well as the heater circuit inside of that pump. Let's go up and look at the top. The suction lines on the left, that hose would go to the DEF tank, and when the pump inside's running and priming, it's pulling fluid in the suction fitting. Excess fluid can go out the return and back down to the DEF tank. So if the pump warms up, it can run a loop of coolant, or DEF I should say, continually to keep things cool. Down on the bottom where it says non-serviceable check valve, you can't see it in this picture, but there's a cap there that goes on a filter. This does have a filter in it. It's got an element that is plastic, very fine mesh. I believe it has to be changed. We change it about every other year on the trucks, and there's an hour rating on the machines. I'm not sure what that is, but it's not, you don't change it every time you're changing your oil or fuel filters, that's for sure. On the far right, you've got a line that goes to the doser. There's only one hose that goes to the doser that has DEF in it. There's two other hoses at the doser that have coolant, so they run a loop of coolant to keep the doser clean, because remember, the doser itself is bolted on the decomp pipe, which the hot exhaust is going through. That line on the right has about 130 to 134 psi. When everything's working great, it's about 132.5 right on the head. That pump's very good at keeping that pressure very, very stable. If the pressure spikes get too high, then you'll log a fault code, and we'll talk about why that happens in a second. When you shut this down, the system is made to return DEF to the tank. So inside of this pump, there's another part that scavenges the fluid back, and it will allow the fluid in the suction line to drain back into the DEF tank. Typically, they try to mount this so that the return line is slightly downhill from the pump to the top of the DEF float. The suction line, the fluid will actually be pumped when it's scavenging back out the suction line and pushed towards the tank. Again, they try to route these hoses. The routing of the DEF hoses is very important, so if you replace a DEF hose, make sure you route it the exact place that it was. They do that so that DEF doesn't freeze in a line. You don't want an S loop in a line because that can interfere with the pump being able to empty itself. The doser, when the pump is scavenging the fluid back, it can actually be opened by the ECM to allow air to go into the line so it can pull that line empty, because you don't want that doser injector to freeze as well. If it gets down below zero, the DEF fluid will freeze hard enough to crack, just like water cracks pipes. It'll crack these fittings and everything else. Notice on the suction fitting, it says non-serviceable filter in here. There's a very, very small filter pressed down in there. If you start having problems with DEF pressure and you check the flow and it's low, then you may have to change that fitting. You can't change that filter. It's not serviceable. There's a check valve in the center, return so that fluid can't drain back overnight into the pump should something happen and gravity want to do that. This is an illustrated view of the DEF pump. It swings around to the other side. I've got the part numbers for that fitting that has the filter on it, the suction fitting, I should say, in it. And also for the backflow connector, the part numbers there. The early DEF pumps didn't have the check valve and the backflow connector. They were all three black in color, and so they made that fitting with the backflow check valve in it white so that people could visually know that it had the updated fitting in it, because the biggest problem they had was the freezing of the pump, the lines, that kind of stuff, and all this work solved all that. You can see the plug in the top right corner there. To unlock it, you pull that slide out as you lift the plug off. It comes off pretty easily, and that's about it for this view. Let's move on. This next view is actually the insert that it comes in the newer DEF tanks. If your tank is older and doesn't have this, if you can buy this and upfit it, and you'd have to get the part number from the dealer, it'd be a great idea. Some of the early DEF tanks did not have a filter. This is 200 micron filter, and you can see there the faults: 1682, 3574, and 3596. Those are classic faults that you'll get from damage in a DEF pump because of dirt that got in a DEF tank. And the next slide is going to show us some dirt from a tank problem we had just a couple weeks ago. And this is a photo that I was sent from a guy on site, and this is what he was getting out of the bottom of the DEF tank. He took it off and ran it in the DEF into a bucket, and it was full of particles of dirt and sand. And we had put a couple DEF pumps on this machine, and they were lasting about 6 months, and we couldn't figure out why. And finally, when we saw these 3 faults, we told him, take that tank off and clean it, and I want to see if there's anything in it. And sure enough, there you go. And once we got this problem solved, the problem went away. And this DEF tank did not have the filter you just saw in it because it was an older tank. So dirt will get you in trouble every time. In a nutshell, the DEF pump doesn't really need a lot of maintenance. It's got a filter on it. Follow the maintenance schedule for that. If the filter you took out doesn't look like what you're putting in, they've had some updates on the filters, and they've added another piece in there with the filter. So you'll get instructions with the filter. Just follow them and you'll be fine. There's nothing on the pump itself that you need to do. The biggest thing that you can do is keep dirt out of that DEF tank. If you think your tank's got dirt in it, it's worth it to drain it if there's a plug in the bottom and flush it out. Or if there's not, to pull it off on a day when you got time to do it and clean it out good. They say to use distilled water to flush it out, and then make sure the DEF that goes in it is clean. Where we are, we have a pump like a gas pump to fill our DEF tank because we have so many units that go through the station, and that's in an enclosed box. And people have to pull that out, wipe the end off. They have to wipe off around the tank before they open it up, and then carefully watch they don't stick it in and walk away. So keep that fluid going in there clean. Only put DEF in the tank, and you ought to be in good shape. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.